I am Jen Beck with the Nashville Technology Council here in Nashville, Tennessee, and welcome to our Tech Coach event. Today's topic is diversity in personality, culture, and communication styles. I'm pleased to announce our speaker, Ebony Butler. She's with BGSF and is the VP of Diversity and Development. Ebony, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. First off, thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to chat and to transfer knowledge and also to learn from everyone else on this call. I greatly appreciate it. I want to first just do a pulse check to make sure that we can see the screen. If you cannot see my screen, would you please let me know?
I see it.
Okay. Perfect. All righty. And so we're going to spend some time talking about diversity. We're going to talk about how diversity permeates our culture, particularly at work. I have been in the learning and development space for 24 plus years, and I have been practicing, studying, learning everything about diversity, equity, and inclusion belonging now for 10 years. And with all of that being said, I will tell you that I am always still growing and always still learning. And so thank you again for allowing us this opportunity. And we're going to go ahead and dive right in. I also do want to preface one thing. We're going to hit on a lot of concepts here. And I really do believe in the power of transferring knowledge in a way that's going to allow it to really permeate and shift how we think, which will then shift how we show up in the workplace. With that being said, some of the concepts we're going to discuss, I will provide a high-level overview, and then I will ask you to put a pin in it to allow you an opportunity to do some individual self-study to learn more about that concept. And I'm just going to the, all righty. What are we going to focus on today? We're going to talk about this thing called diversity of thought. What does that mean? We're also going to peel back the onion and explore the importance of diversity and the value add. We're also going to talk about, is diversity of thought enough? And then that'll shift how we show up and how we think going forward. We'll discuss types of diversity that add value in the workplace. We'll also talk about factors influencing communication, and then strategies we can implement to minimize communication challenges based on having a diverse workforce, a diverse organization, a diverse group of friends, just diversity all around. What are some core objectives you'll be able to walk away from this experience? You will be able to explain the importance of various types of diversity at work. You'll also know how to flex your communication style to better communicate with everyone. It's not enough to just be heard, we have to be received. And so how do we do that? And we do that by flexing our communication style to meet the needs of others. That allows us to understand what motivates them in the workplace. We will also be able to apply some techniques to combat communication challenges, and we're going to explore varying challenges. We're going to gain insight on how to communicate professionally. And we're also going to recognize cultural differences that influence people at work. As I've had an opportunity to look at a little bit of background on some of you here, what I understand is some of us are students, some of us are not. I also understand that some of us are looking for work, some are not looking for work. Anything we discuss in this experience, you will be able to apply for whatever forum, environment you're in. Before we get started talking a little bit more about diversity of thought, let me pause and see any initial questions, thoughts, or just concerns you may have. All righty, so let's talk about diversity of thought and what is it? Diversity of thought is a concept which champions the idea of bringing together individuals from different cultures, backgrounds, and personalities to share thoughts. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Would you all agree? Sounds pretty good. Well, let me talk to you a little bit about the challenge when we only focus on diversity of thought. The challenge when we only focus on diversity of thought is that diversity of thought is the idea that people in a group don't need to look different or identify with an underrepresented group to bring varying diverse viewpoints to the table. And so let me pause and say this. Diversity of thought, if we only focus there, what was happening in our diversity, equity, inclusion space is that it would prevent people from really being able to tap into people who look differently, were raised differently, who love differently. We weren't focused enough on all those different areas of diversity because we felt like, well, if I just have a different way of thinking, we can all be sitting around the table looking exactly alike. But as long as we have a different way of thinking, that's enough. While diversity of thought is one great component, we also have to start exploring more diverse representation. And so diversity of thoughts, along with diversity of representation, it drives so many value adds. It's very valuable to any unique experience, particularly in communications. It helps to develop creativity and innovation. It helps us to better solve problems. And we're going to dig deeper to talk about, well, what are these extra pieces of diversity that just doesn't focus on diversity of thought? We're going to get into that. It improves our decision-making abilities. It helps us even to be more agile when it comes to resources we explore when we are making decisions. It increases our adaptability. It enhances our cultural competence. It expands our market reach because not only do we just have people who probably look the same and have different thoughts, we have people that truly look differently, they feel differently, they love differently, they create differently. And all of that adds so much richness into the people we're able to reach in organizations. Increased employee engagement and retention because people see people who look differently, feel differently, sound differently. Enhance employer brand reputation and also improve financial performance for an organization overall. And I also have to say this, when we as human beings start this inclusiveness, not just around diversity of thought, but also diversity of representation, we can ask for more money in different roles we're in because we truly do value inclusivity and we have an array of perspectives that we can draw on. And so diversity of thought coupled with representation, diversity of representation truly does matter. So let's now talk a little bit more. I want you to put in the chat, when I say the word diversity to you, what's one word that comes to mind? When I say diversity to you, what's one word that automatically comes to mind?
Different.
Okay, thank you so much. All righty.
I see cultural.
Okay. And so what I'm going to do now, and I would love for you all to start chatting this. And so you're right. When you think of diversity, most people automatically say differences. So I want you all to talk to me about just taking a look at even this call here. And I know some of us, we can see faces, some of them we can't. But I still feel like you all would be able to chat. What are some elements of difference amongst us on this call? If you can just put it in the chat. What are some elements of difference just with who you see on this call? If you can place that in the chat.
Let's see, Mariana says different ethics or background. And to answer the last question, expansive when they thought of diversity,
Thank you.
genders. And I will add differences in where we are. Some are students and will be looking for a career. Some are in careers now. So we have differences in jobs.
Yes. All righty. And so you all hit on it. There are varying types of diversity at work. We have internal diversity. Now, this is a trait or characteristic a person is born with. And so it's more internal. And so let me just pause and hear what are some examples. And I'll actually take one person that's courageous enough to come off of mute. What's an example, one example of an internal diversity? And it doesn't have to be amongst this group. It could just be in general. Give me an example of an internal diversity. If someone could pipe up and come off of mute, that would be perfect. A trait or characteristic a person is born with.
Communication style.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kate. I appreciate it. Thank you. External. These are attributes, experiences, or circumstances that helps to define a person's identity, but it's not something they're born with. And so I'll go back just for a second to internal, and then I want to hear someone give an example of external. And the reason being is because I'm going to give also an example of external as well. So internal would be gender. It's what you're born with. It could be your ethnicity. It's what you're born with. What about external? Who would like to share an example of an external type of diversity, which is an attribute or experience that helps define that person's identity? And we all have grown to have a lot of external diversity. Who would like to share an example?
Sorry, can I rephrase my example for external? I was getting ahead of myself.
Sure. Sure. Go ahead, Kate.
So communication style or how we interact with each other.
Okay, that would definitely be external as well. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else on an external type of diversity?
Someone said education level, and I would add even the family you grew up in and your experience in the family you grew up in and what that was like.
Yes, yes. And y'all, I'll tell you, a lot of times we don't emphasize those external diversities enough. As a matter of fact, in our organization right now, we're really focused on driving a strong sense of belonging. And the way we're doing that is we're really starting to talk about how can we leverage our personal lived experiences as a value add to how we show up at work. Give you an example for me, for external diversity. I was a young mom. That is a part of my DNA. I wasn't born, as a young mom. And I was a young mom, and it truly has shaped who I am today. That's an external level of diversity. Then we have organizational. This is just difference in job functions, work experience, seniority, department. And so I think that one is pretty much very clear. And I know that even on this call, we all have different organizations. We're a part of different industries. We have different roles within our organization. We have different levels of experience. So that's more organizational. And then worldview encompasses a broad range of beliefs, political affiliations, cultures, travel experiences, etc. And so it's how you view the world. Why are all of these aspects so important? These types of diversity shape who you are. Even though it wasn't all internal, so you weren't born with all of this, but it shapes who you are. And because it shapes who you are, it shapes how you view the world. Some of these external ones even shape how people view you in the world. And those experiences are such a value add to any organization. And so I'll just put this in your ear. If you are looking for an opportunity, if you are looking for work, I want you to start thinking about all of the ways, all of the things that have shaped you to be who you are today. More than likely, it's going to fall in line with one of these areas of diversity. And when you're in that interview, leverage it. That's what will make you different and show up different. And when you walk out the room, us as interviewers are going to be thinking, oh man, I love that. I love how she connected. I love how he did that. I love how he shared that. I love his vulnerability. I'll tell you, it makes people want to hear from you again. Let me pause. What questions? Before now, we dive into some factors that influence communication based on a diverse workforce. So let me pause and see what questions, thoughts, or ideas you have. Alrighty. There are multiple factors that influence how we show up at work, how we show up at a party, how we show up at church, how we show up with friends, how we show up at restaurants. There are many factors that influence how we communicate. And more specifically, there are several factors that influence how we communicate in a diverse workforce. We're going to take a deeper dive into personality styles, cultural differences, generational differences, and unconscious biases. This is when I share that I will give high-level overview. We'll have a little dialogue around these areas. And then I'm just going to ask for you to take notes and do some more independent study to learn more and go deeper in these areas that particularly interest you. The first one, personality styles. I am certain that some of you have taken different personality assessments. And I want to focus on, so there are many personality assessments, and I'll share that a lot of the personality assessments, the psychologists who have developed these different behavioral styles, personality tests, there are two areas that they're really focused on, particularly at work. They're focused on how do people interact with people and how do people approach work. How do people interact with people and how people approach work? And so, as you know, or just to share, there are typically 4 different styles. I think about Myers-Briggs assessments. I think about Strength Finders assessments. I think about DISC assessments. I think about all of these different personality styles. It truly normally has 4 areas that they're focused on. So for the purpose of our time today, we're going to dive into personality styles. Now, as I go through this piece, I am going to ask you all to start chatting some responses. There are 4 styles that show up at work. There are 4 styles that show up at home. You have the dominant style. You have the inspiring style. You have the supportive style, and you have a cautious style. Now, let me share this. The dominant and inspiring, they have things in common. The cautious and supportive, those quadrants have things in common. And then, of course, dominant and cautious have things in common, and inspiring and supportive have things in common. What I'm going to do right now is just give you a high-level overview to the extreme of that style. I'm just going to give it to you to the extreme of that style. One other thing I want to preface, if you do any type of study on this particular assessment, which is DISC, D-I-S-C, you will find that you might have a different word. So inspiring, it just how the personality style over time. Inspiring, you might see influential. Supportive, you might see steadiness, but they're all the same. So dominant. Dominant people are very task-oriented. They are very quick-paced and outgoing. Dominant people tend to walk fast, talk fast, and tell. They typically tell. They're very authoritative. They're very independent. Then we have the I's, the inspiring people. Inspiring is people who naturally lean into inspiring. They have the thing in common with dominant that they're very fast paced. They talk fast. They walk fast. They also, when they are inspiring, they typically have a lot of inflection in their tone. When they are inspiring, they are people oriented. And so when you think about the task or the people, and again, I'm not saying that if you're inspiring, you have no form of task in you. It's just your natural lean. You are more people focused, more collaboration focused versus dominant, more independent and task focused. Both of these, the D's and the I's, they typically do the talking and they normally tell. They tell. Questions about the D and the I? All righty. Now
I'm sorry. Will these be your salespeople?
Oh, really nice question. I try not to put people in boxes. Yes, I do. Being a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've recognized we can't put people in boxes. And I will say this, a lot of times salespeople might fall in the dominant and the inspiring. They might fall there. And I always encourage you to pay attention to what you see or hear a person doing or saying, and that'll kind of help you to know where they might fit. And I would say try not to put people in boxes. And there's a high probability of salespeople probably being in the D and the I. Yes.
They're more outgoing usually, is what I was thinking.
They're more outgoing, most definitely. Now, with this, and again, I could talk about this for days, and I don't have time to do that, but I will share that normally you might be like a D and an S. So there's like a secondary style. I won't be able to get into that today. And so you might have someone who's a salesperson, they're an I and a C, but so they're top I and a C. So the styles can flex a little bit.
We've got one comment that says D are frequently leaders, managers, or folks in charge. They almost naturally take control in the absence of control or structure.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's talk about S's. S's are supportive. And so when you think about S's, how they are in common with inspiring, they're people focused. How they're different from inspiring, they're more moderate pace. So they're not like the D's and the I's that are very fast paced. The S's are more moderate pace. They're very collaborative. They pause. They think. They think about people. They ask questions. So that's slightly different from D's and I's that normally tell. They normally ask. They also might come across as reserved. Whereas dominant people might come across as intense, inspiring people might come across as just very friendly and outgoing, but supportive, they're going to come across as, just supportive and also more reserved. And then the C. The C's are cautious. They are like supportive because they're reserved, they're slower paced in how they think things through. They're very analytical. They ask questions. They love accuracy. And how they are like dominant is that they are more focused on the task at hand versus the people. I'll give you one word to go with each of these and then we'll move on. Dominance, and I'm going to share the 4 P's, I call it. Dominance, they love power. Inspiring, they love popularity. And when I say popularity, I'm not talking about like a 6-year-old child popularity. They're just the ones that if there's a networking event, they're going to be the ones that say, let's go. S's, they focus on peace. They want everybody to get along. And then C for cautious, they're more focused on, they're more focused on, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I just had a thought. Accuracy. They're focused on process. Sorry, they're focused on process. Just a high level overview of that. On the extreme end, because we don't have the opportunity to actually do an assessment, where do you believe you fall? On the, take it to the extreme. Do you think you naturally lean to the D? You naturally lean to the I, the S, or the C, if you'll just put that in the chat. Where do you naturally just lean?
I feel like I'm supportive, possibly.
Okay.
I see a D, C, C, S,
Okay. All right.
C.
And okay. All righty. And so I am a D. And a lot of people would think that I would be an I because I do a lot of speaking and teaching. That's why I say try not to get the roles confused. Just think about how someone shows up, how they engage work, how they engage people. And so one quick thing just to kind of put this all together with communication styles, and then we'll move on. Put in, or I'll actually, if someone could come off of mute and just tell us this. If you are a dominant, so someone, if you're dominant, if your main style is dominant, and you're communicating with someone who is more supportive, what's one thing you might want to consider when you're communicating with them in the workplace? Whoever would like to share. So you're dominant. Maybe you need to communicate a change. Something's about to change. What's something you can be cognizant of, or how should you flex your communication style to really be able to be received by the supportive person?
Someone said, ask for feedback, opinions, make them feel, I'm not sure what that word is. Oh, involved. Make them
Okay.
feel involved. And I was going to say personally, since I'm an S, I would say speak to them like it's a collaboration, or to get their thoughts on it, and come with a softer approach than a strong, hard, dominant approach.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
I would say tell them more about how the change is going to affect the people.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. We'll do one more, and I promise you we have to move. So let's just say, for instance, you are cautious. You are cautious, because I noticed we had a lot of C's here too. And you are working with someone who's inspiring. What might you consider, how might you shift your style so that you can be received by someone who's more people-oriented, someone's more fast-paced?
I'd say have your facts ready, lay it out succinctly and efficiently.
Thank you. All righty. Okay. So that's talking about the personality style. So we see that this is just one area of difference. Jen,
One more thing. Someone said, talk about the big picture, vision, goals, etc.
Oh, that's a really good point. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. All right. So this is one factor of difference that happens in the workplace, just your own innate like personality style. So let's now just, and I'll highlight only a few of these for cultural differences. I would strongly suggest, if you're really interested in learning more about this, maybe take a picture of it and, just learn more about it. But we basically have just different cultural differences, right? And so there's a thing called power distance. So when you think about these different quadrants or these different areas in which people show up differently, oftentimes it's by power. So if that country had a high level of power versus a low level of power. Collectivism or individualism, that means, do they really see themselves as more individual? That, what, I can be all that I can be. I can do awesome things in this space because of me, and or are a person coming from coming from a country that's more focused on how we do together as a society, how we do together as a group. So there are just different areas here. Uncertainty. There are certain countries that they have a high tolerance for levels of uncertainty, whereas there are other countries that do not have a high tolerance for levels of uncertainty. Femininity versus masculinity. And I'll share with you, there are some countries that they are truly more focused on success, their job, a lot of material things that would be more masculinity, whereas countries that are more focused on femininity, they care more about values, family, everyone being loved and cared for. Long-term orientation. These are countries where they are more futuristic in their approach on how they view things long-term versus they are short-term planners, and the way they view goals and the way they view, how they're going to be successful is more short-term. And then restraint versus indulgence. This is just another thing. And I'll share that with restraint versus indulgence, this could be a lot of countries who are really focused on high levels of indulgence. They really do believe more in, let's see how to say it. They believe more in truly enjoying life. I'll just say that, truly enjoying life. Whereas countries where they don't focus much on that, that's going to be more on the restraint side. And so I go through all this to say this could be a whole nother class for a whole nother moment, but there are not only personality styles we just talked about, there are also cultural differences. And those cultural differences have an array of different attributes that that country is steeped in, and that person now comes to organizations, to the restaurant, to wherever you're going with those cultural influences. And so it's very important for us to keep cultural differences in mind.
Someone's
And-
put in the chat, I think in that last one, was it restraint versus indulgence? Have a drink. What's the worry? Things will be okay.
Yeah, that's going to be, yes, and that's
Indulgence.
definitely going to be more indulgence. Yes, yes, really good. All righty. And then the one that you all are, I'm sure, hearing a lot about is around generational differences. We, for the first time, have 5 generations in the workforce. And we call, here it's called maturists, but we also think about traditionalists. And then, of course, baby boomers, we have Gen Xers, Gen Y, and Gen Z. And what's now coming is the alpha generation that we don't have here yet. But these are the 5 generations that are currently in the workforce. So this adds another level of diversity, another level of difference. And so this just really speaks to that importance of, as a leader, how do we have to shift how we communicate with others? Let's say, for instance, we're a Gen Y, so a millennial, and we're communicating with baby boomers. What do they care about? And just in summary, and if you get a chance to look at like the formative experiences, I'll share this. When you think about the maturists and or traditionalists, and you also think about the baby boomers, a lot of the things that they experience cause them to be in the workforce always having a mentality of survival mode. And so some people from our younger generation might feel like, man, these people work too much and all of that. But if you look at the formative experiences and the what was happening in the world at that time, a lot of people on the older generation, more mature generation, they were in that survival mode. And that's how they show up sometimes in the workplace. They're going to be loyal. You're going to see them being in an organization for 15 plus years, and so you see that. But then as we go into like the Gen Xers, and I'll say that that's where I fall. I heard the other day that I'm really considered a genennial because it's like the low end of the Gen X to the beginning of the millennials. And for Gen Xers, what we know is that, of course, they were raised by baby boomers and maturists. And because the maturists and the baby boomers really helped to form a stable life for us because of the things that they were going through that put them in survival mode, what happens is that with my generation, Gen Xers, we focus more on the standard of living. We focus more on how do we want to live. And that is one reason why you'll see post-COVID, some people that were in the Gen X, some navigated they were comfortable going and working from home, and some weren't, because the Gen Xers are kind of in that space where they have a lot of influence from the more mature generation, and they're also raising Gen Y and Gen Zers. Okay. And so their focus, Gen Xers, has always been the standard of living. One other thing to just note is that Gen Xers are very independent because a lot of us were latchkey kids. What does that mean? We went home and went to school. Today, we can't show anyone that we're going home alone. But back then, we would have our tennis shoe string with our key on it, and we were latchkey kids. And so how do we show up in the workplace? We show up as more independent. And there's also that level of loyalty as well. Now, some of the great things I love about Gen Y and Gen Zers. Gen Y and Gen Zers go against the norm. They create the rules. And tell you, Gen Xers, we are reaping the benefits of Gen Y, Gen Z. You think about mental health days. You think about those type of things that we didn't have coming up. And times for Gen Y and Gen Z, they're truly focused on passion and service. They want to do what drives them. They're focused on justice. And so having that understanding that you have 5 generations in the workforce and knowing that they all have different motivations is also extremely key to the success of communication. Let me pause and just see what questions, thoughts you have on generational differences.
Someone said it's a great refresher for them. Daryl, thank you.
Thank you. I would love for, if you feel comfortable doing it, I would love for you to put which generation are you? Are you a traditionalist or a maturist? Are you baby boomers, Gen Xers, Gen Y, and Gen Z? I'm just curious. What's the combination? What does it look like, the diversity here?
Got Gen X, I can't even say it, Genennial, whatever you said.
Yeah.
Genennial. Gen Y, born in Gen Z, but I feel like Gen Y.
Okay.
Gen Y.
Yeah. And so with this, I also want to just go back to the very beginning. With all of these different levels of difference, I just say, approach everyone for who they are and how they are with you as an individual. Don't think about, oh, well, they're a Gen Z, so they automatically feel this way, or they're automatically tech savvy, or, oh, they're a Gen Z and they're a D, they're dominant. Try not to really put all of that into it. I think the purpose is for us to really recognize that generational differences play a huge role. Personality differences, cultural differences, all of these differences play a huge role in why there are challenges with communication. And we will eventually talk about, well, what are some techniques? What are some best practices to stay clear of those challenges.
And
Sure.
also, I'll add, I think everyone has to be able to read the room. And as you said, be aware of who you're talking to, because you cannot generalize that just because someone is a Gen Y or Gen Z, that they are going to be in that stereotypical, millennials have gotten a bad rap for not being hard workers or not, I don't know, wanting all this flexibility and being more free flow, but I have worked with some really hardworking millennials, so you can't put people in a box.
Yeah, most definitely.
Thanks,
Alright.
Daryl. You said that, Jen.
Thank you. And then let's talk about this thing called unconscious bias. I first want to share that all of us are biased about a certain thing to a certain degree. Not one of us on this call is free of bias. Bias happens, unconscious bias happens when our brain makes snap judgments based on the information it receives and then adds meaning to it. A lot of times when we are biased because we haven't allowed ourselves to pause and think. And we are typically reacting versus responding. Biases can lead to erroneous judgments due to their impact on our decision making and behavior. And I also want to share that unconscious bias does not always work against someone. Sometimes that unconscious bias works for someone. And all of the time, we are running the risk of really being fair and equitable for everyone or for that thing. And so here are a few biases that typically show up in the workplace. I'm going to give you a moment to land your eyes here, and then we will talk about some of these biases. Why are we talking about this? Because unconscious biases is a big reason for communication challenges. So I'll give you a moment to look at those. And I would love to get 2 volunteers to come off of mute and share an example on how you've seen one of these biases show up for you personally or professionally. Who would like to share? Okay, I'll share one example and then I'll see if anyone has another one. Distance bias. Distance bias typically shows up when, especially in our world now, post-COVID, where we have remote workers. Sometimes, let's say, for instance, I have a team, I have maybe 2 people that are local to Dallas, and then I have maybe 3 people that are in California. Distance bias could show up because maybe my relationship is just built so much closer with my 2 team members here in Dallas, and it's only because of distance, because that person's all the way in California. Why is that important to know as a leader, as entering the workforce? We have to be cognizant of things that we can do intentionally to minimize distance bias. And so that's an example of how distance bias shows up. And I'll give you one more. One more example would be interviewing. If I had to interview 8 people, more than likely, my 7th and 8th person, if I buy into or feed into distance bias, and it's also called recency bias, I could have a bias for those people because they're the last ones that were on my mind. That shows up. So distance slash recency bias. But let me hear from you. Any of these biases have shown up and you would like to provide an example? And it could be, maybe you didn't do it, you've seen it show up. Who would like to share?
We have in the chat, I have both experience bias and gender bias. Experience thinking that because someone has a lot of experience, they'll be good at their job. They ended up getting fired. Definitely have shown the tall white man, he must be good. That usually gets downgraded quickly, regularly.
Thank you. Thank you. And that actually, and I was revealing this list, that also goes to prototyping bias, that example you just gave. We assume that someone is perfect for a role based on stereotypes. This happens all the time when you see someone that's really tall. Oh, you played basketball. That's prototyping bias. And so thank you for that example. That was a great example. Who's next? Who would like to share? And then after that, I'll talk to you about why I brought these three in last. Who else would like to share? Okay, Kate, thank you.
I think in classrooms, we very often see, or I very often see the halo and horns effect of that bias towards, oh, that person's a star student, so anything they do is taken with more understanding and I think more generosity of, oh, of course you're going to get sick, and the horns effect of someone who maybe struggled, and there's this idea that you're not working hard enough. Everything you do gets scrutinized a little bit more.
That is so true, Kate. Thank you for sharing that. And horns and halos are emphasized by confirmation bias. So this goes into why I highlighted those three last. There are like 45 to probably 52 biases that show up. And you can take off 44 to 42, 45, and you can actually group them into three: confirmation bias, prototyping bias, and similarity bias. Those are like the common ones. And then the other ones can kind of fall underneath it. You a really great point around horns and halo. So confirmation bias is when we have a tendency to look for information that supports our own beliefs. This happens all the time politically. It happens all the time religiously. It happens all the time. So what the horn and halo effect will do to that confirmation bias is, I research this information, or I believe that my daughter is an awesome student, but my sons are kind of okay? And so the halo effect would be that I would always see my daughter in this supreme light. And confirmation bias says, see, yes, she just made up her bed. That's the reason I'm confirming it. That's the reason that, yes, she is a great child, right? But then horns effect is, to your point, when that person, it's something that you don't agree. And guess what? Confirmation bias is going to allow you to continue to look for evidence that supports they're not a good kid. See, they didn't clean their room. That's confirmation bias. You're just finding ways to confirm your own beliefs. And it could be either a horns effect on it or a halo effect on it. And then, of course, similarity bias happens all the time. This is when we tend to gravitate toward people who look, think, feel, act like ourselves. Maybe you're, maybe you all went to the same college, so you just have an affinity or a similarity bias. You're just drawn to them. Maybe you, have the same, from the same neighborhood. So it's where you look for people that you have something in common with. And similarity bias happens all the time as well.
In the chat window, someone said, +1 to what Kate said. I see or notice it more on the downside. The whole broken window syndrome applied to people. You make one mistake, so you're going to be a bad performer for everything all the way in the future.
That is really nice. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll have one other quick thing for confirmation bias. I was doing some research and I found this, and I'm sure you all have had this happen. You purchase a car. As soon as you purchase a car, don't you see a whole bunch of those cars on the road? Confirmation bias. Our brains are wired to now go there. Now, those same cars were on the road 3 weeks ago, yesterday, before you bought the car. It just didn't stand out to you like it did once you purchased a car. And so every time now you see that car, it's a confirmation that, yep, I made the best decision. That's a personal example and kind of funny example of confirmation bias. So what are some things we can do to minimize communication challenges out of everything we've heard? So we've talked about diversity of thought, and diversity of thought is good. And we also need to weave in diversity of representation. Diversity of representation leads us to start exploring the 4 different types of diversity. And with that, it leads us to talk about all the ways we can be diverse in the workplace or in our friend groups. And that could be our personalities are different. That can be maybe we're from a whole nother country, so our cultures are different. And even domestically, the West might have a whole different culture from the South, might have a whole different culture from the North. And so just understanding those cultural differences. We also spent some time talking about generational differences. And then lastly, we talked about how we manage and or dive into or pull back from different unconscious biases. So some strategies to minimize communication challenges: utilize a diverse range of communication channels, particularly if we're talking about generational differences, particularly if we're talking about personality styles. I'll share this. If you are a supportive person and that's your style, you might tend to write long emails. A person who's on the dominant side, they want to just see bullet points. And so we might have to bullet point things to get to it. And so use a diverse range of communication channels and styles. Avoid slang and jargon. Use shared language, and that could definitely be from cultural beliefs as well as generational beliefs. Pause and think to minimize assumptions. That's when those biases creep in, when we're not pausing to think and we're just reacting versus responding. Listen to understand instead of just listening to respond. Have open body language, especially if you're in a virtual environment. Try to come on camera as much as you can and have open body language. Check your messages before you send them. And I would want to also say, really walk away from a text message or an email when you're upset or you're overly emotional. Just stay away from that. Maybe even just let it sit and come back the next day, the next morning. Avoid sending messages when you're emotional. Enrich your vocabulary so you can use just different ways to communicate based on different personality styles, different cultures, different generations, and just adapt your communication style to others. And a lot of that is steeped in emotional intelligence, which is a whole nother topic. What I hope you were able to take away today is that diversity of thought and representation is the key to organizational success. Intentionally adapt your communication style to be received and not just heard. Understand what motivates others. And if you want to understand that more, I highly encourage you, look into the DISC profile, the DISC personality assessment. Really look into generational differences to understand more about what motivates various generations. Really look into cultural backgrounds to understand how they navigate spaces and how they're motivated. Apply techniques to combat communication challenges. A lot of it is pausing, taking a deep breath, minimizing the biases by asking questions to not assume. Gain insight on how to communicate professionally, and recognize cultural differences that influence people at work.
Thank you so much, Ebony.
Thank you. Y'all have a good one.